Okay, we're going to get started in just a moment. Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you for webyeshiva.org, a wonderful platform for Torah study that emanates out of Jerusalem. And our hearts and our prayers are for the people of Israel at this time. And may our Torah study during this time add merit to our people. And let us get started with Emunot Videot, section 1 or treatise 1, chapter 3, which we are continuing today. In order to get our bearings, I want to bring up my outline as I do every week. And you can always find these handouts in one of two places. You can find it in the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim and Emunot Videot. And you can also find this at the platform webyeshiva.org in the course description for today's course. Today, we're going to be focusing on one particular argument for, or one particular model for the origin of the universe that was very much in vogue in the time that Reb Saadia Gaon lived in the 10th century. And that's why the title of our discussion today is called Refuting Dualism. So just to review, chapter 3 of the first treatise of Emunot Videot is devoted to, after Reb Saadia had, in his opinion, successfully proven that the world was created from absolute nothing, and that it was created in time, and that it was created by God, and that God did not use himself to create the universe, did not create from himself. After Rabbi Saadia had successfully proven all of these things, he now provides us with 12 additional models of cosmogony, the origins of existence, and he feels that in order to be able to support his arguments, he needs to refute those 12 opposing arguments. This is the worldview, the philosophical method that Reb Saadia is using. It's not just enough to argue for mine, but I also have to present you the other side and show you why it is incorrect. So he is now up to the 5th of the 13 models. In other words, he presented the correct model, which is the Torah view, as number 1, and now he has an additional 12. So the last time we met a couple of weeks ago, we discussed the first 3 of those additional models, and now we're discussing the next one, and that is dualism. Reb Saadia devotes the most amount of time in this chapter on this particular model, on this particular theory, probably because it was so much in vogue in the Middle East during his lifetime in the 10th century. It's important to note that while dualism, the belief that there are 2 deities that are responsible for creation, is not something that most of us in the Western world can associate with, it was something still very much in vogue. Now, it begins with the religion of Zoroastrianism, the founder Zoroaster or Zarathustra, all the way back in the ancient world. Zoroastrianism is probably almost or even older than Judaism itself, than monotheism. And it was the belief that there were 2 different gods that were assigned names, and these gods were responsible for this constant struggle between good and evil that we find existing in the world, because one was the god of good and the other one was the god of evil. There was a later type of dualism that arose in the 2nd, or actually 3rd century of the Common Era by a philosopher named Mani, and it became known as Manichaeism. There are significant differences between these 2 forms of dualism, but for our purposes, what Rabbi Saadia seems to be describing is probably closer to Manichaeism than Zoroastrianism. In any event, we're going to see how he depicts this religious belief and also philosophical belief as how the world came into existence, and then we're going to watch him refute it. Again, why is he devoting so much time to it? Simply because it is such a popular belief in his time. So he says, we'll now discuss and refute the view of dualism, those who believe in 2 eternal creators. Argues Reb Sadia, this is more senseless, less logical than the previously mentioned models. And the reason is because the whole basis of their belief is because they deny that two opposites could emit from one singular source or being, because they had never witnessed anything like this. The argument goes something like this. To believe in a singular God, which is what the Western world believes, monotheism believes that one God is responsible for everything, you also have to acknowledge that the great variety and diversity that we see existing in our world is only coming from one source. The difficulty is that we encounter so many opposites. We encounter up and down. We encounter light and darkness. We encounter good and evil. We encounter elements like fire and water that oppose each other. How can all of these things emanate from one source and yet be such polar opposites? This was the argument that the dualists made in order to conclude that there really must be two deities instead of one. They observe that all things in this world contain good and evil, harm and benefit. They conclude that all that is good and beneficial must emanate from one source that is entirely good, while that which is evil and harmful emanates from a source or a deity or a foundation that is entirely evil. They ascribe, and now he's getting into a little bit more stylized and specific description, that there are spatial qualities to these two entities. So apparently there's, in this type of dualist theology, there was some kind of ascription to these two deities occupying space in some way. So these two deities have spatial qualities that, and the argument is that the good deity is boundless on five sides. It is boundless going up, and it is boundless going in all the different horizontal directions, north, east, south, and west. But the good force or the good deity is bounded on the bottom, on the sixth side, where it touches the evil source. So he's describing like two infinite beings which are finite in the point where they meet each other. So conversely, the evil source is boundless on five sides. Going down, it's infinite, going infinitely downwards, and also horizontally going out, it is infinite, but it is bounded at going up in the place where it meets the good deity. Originally, these two sources were separated, but then at some point in time, these two deities or forces or principles connected and intersected. As a result, this intersection point or this intersected portion of the two deities became the entire physical realm. So what we encounter in our reality is a commingling of these two deified forces that through this intersection creates this mishmash of a reality that we find where everything is mixed together, a mixture of good and evil, a mixture of opposites. This intersection, they contend, however, is only temporary, and eventually good will prevail over evil. The evil source will be weakened and will cease its activity. That's the ultimate, like, so I guess, nirvana or ultimate utopia, where there will be a removal of all evil and only good will prevail. So Reb Sadia says, I will note now my objections to each statement of those who promote this model. Firstly, we take all the aforementioned arguments from chapters 1 and 2, wherein of this first treatise, wherein we were able to demonstrate that all bodies were created ex nihilo, and that nothing that is a body has existed eternally. So, number one, if you're going to suggest that these two deities are bodies, some kind of spatially confined bodies, then they cannot exist eternally. We were also able to prove that when God created reality, he did not create it from a portion of himself. And that also is used to address this dualist argument that the intersecting of these two deities is what forms reality. All these arguments may also be lodged against those who believe in this theory. But then he says, I have an additional 15 points of argumentation unique to this opinion, which I will now present, wherein I take their own arguments and turn them against them. Now, we're not going to debate the strength or the validity of each one of these 15 points. We're just going to, in this short time that we have together, present the 15 arguments that Reb Sadia makes. And through this exercise, we get an insight to the way that he approaches religious philosophy, and the way that he approaches trying to refute the other beliefs of his time. Number one, we see a person who became angry and then later calms down and says, I forgive whoever offended me. Clearly, there are two opposite qualities within this person. If you can have a person who has two completely opposite emotions, in 1 hour, and on Monday he's angry, and on Tuesday he's very calm and forgiving and kind, so then you do see that two opposites emanate from one being. If this individual cannot be a mixture of good and evil, you must either say that not only is his forgiveness based on the goodness that is inherent within him, but also his anger. And it's impossible to say that it is evil in him that forgives, since forgiveness is a good. We thus see anger is evil, forgiveness is good, and therefore we see two opposites emanating from one being, from the human being. The human being is a mixture of both good and evil. And if you can't have two things coexisting that are opposites within one being, well, just look at the world around us and you see that that happens all the time. Number two, another person can commit murder or theft and then later is brought to confession and repentance. Once again, this is not emotional states, but rather moral states. And so too, you find opposing moral states within the same human being. Two opposites, the evil of murder or theft and the good of confession and repentance, emerge from one being. Argument number three, the only way to reconcile the combination of good and evil that we see in people is to suggest that the two are not mixed at all within that same person. I apologize for the typo. We'd have to suggest that the only way that a person can contain both good and evil is to say the good and evil are completely separated. And it's almost like you would have to say that the person is really like, the brain maybe. Just like we have two hemispheres of the brain, the right hemisphere is for the good, the left hemisphere is for the evil, but never do the two meet. And that would be the only way that one could suggest, if one was a dualist, how they could reconcile how one person can be a mixture of both, because really it's two separate components within the same individual. But if so, how could it be that a person retains a mental memory of his previous evil when the good within him takes over? We observe the contrary, so that it must be the same being who previously did evil is now doing good, and the two parts of that being are bridged in the mind. In other words, the mental faculty that's in charge of memory, if it can retain a memory of my previous evil and retain that memory and that image in my mind, even when I'm tapping into the good, it means that there is a combination between good and evil within the very same human being. So that's not going to work. You can't say that a human being is completely bisected and never the twain shall meet. That's clearly not the case. Now, the next point, the next series of argumentation is that part of the dualist model is the belief that two creators are responsible for one product that was created by the two of them jointly. So let's say you have one human being who was created, according to the dualist's opinion, by the intersection and the joint work of both the deity of the good and the deity of the bad. This is problematic for two reasons, and this is argument number four. Firstly, if each of the two deities is capable of creation, to say that each one is creating the entire product within creation is an absurdity, since once the first deity creates, there's nothing left for the second one to make. And if you argue that each deity creates only a portion of the product, what is to stop each creator from making all of it? Reb Sadia is working under the assumption that by virtue of it being a deity and being infinitely unbounded in all five directions except where the two of them meet, it means that there's omnipotence in each of these deities. The God of good is omnipotent and the God of evil is omnipotent. If they're omnipotent and each one is independently capable of creating each and every component of creation, why then do you need the contribution of both to create something that can be created by only one of them? Again, a philosophical absurdity to require two to create something that one independently could create. And the next argument, which is a corollary of that, by their definition of these two creative deities, each one being omnipotent and can just as easily not create as create. When you say that a being is omnipotent, it means that it also has the choice to not create. If that being the case, suppose one of the deities chooses to create X and the other deity chooses to not create the same X. This results in X being both produced and not produced, which is a clear contradiction or absurdity It reminded me of Schrodinger's cat, the physics mind experiment by a scientist named Schrodinger, who argued that since we don't know, sometimes in quantum mechanics, um, uh, um, matter acts as a wave, sometimes it acts as a particle. And if you put something in a box with a cat that releases a poison, depending upon whether it's a wave and a particle, and in physics it's both a wave and a particle, then it would turn out that the cat would be both alive and dead at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. So in a medieval argument of that kind, if you have two deities that are responsible for creating one individual component of creation, then if one deity were to decide to not create and the other deity were to decide to create, it would turn out that that product that is the object of each deity's focus would both exist and not exist simultaneously, and that's a logical impossibility. So up until now, says Reb Sadia, we have demonstrated that those who subscribe to this belief deny that which is witnessed in reality. In other words, we've shown that they deny that opposites can emanate from one being, which we have demonstrated to be untrue. Clearly, you can have one person emanate both good and evil. And we have shown that one product cannot be the handiwork of two almighty creators. Now let's continue. Their reason for rejecting creation from nothing, or creatio ex nihilo, is based on the fact that they never experienced it. But they have created a theory that is also based on something never experienced. In other words, what Reb Sadia is trying to demonstrate, and he's done this also for the previous models as well that he's rejected, is that sometimes in your effort to reject the creation model of the Torah, and it's based on the fact that we've never seen something coming from nothing, I come up with an alternate theory, which is just as difficult to maintain because it requires you to believe in something that has never been witnessed by man ever. And so you don't really gain anything. And that's the argument that he's making. So continuing these 15 arguments, number 6 is, namely, they assert that the two sources or the two deities are boundless on 5 sides respectively, even though the only thing they perceive in their model is the two bounded sides that intersect with each other. Having only perceived the bounded aspects of these two sources or deities, they have no basis upon which to assume that the sides they have not perceived are boundless. On what basis do you assert that these two deities are infinitely unbounded on all other sides except for the points of intersection? On what basis can you say that? You've never observed that. You only perceive our reality, which is the intersection point. You don't perceive the infinite boundlessness of the deities everywhere else. 7, they claim that only a very small amount of the two sources actually intersect to give rise to our physical reality. But that is the only portion of these deities that they perceive. On what basis do they assert that the vast majority of these deities are in an uncombined state, existing independently of each other? And number 8, from where did they adduce that the two sources existed separately eternally, and only at some point in time, at what we call creation, they partially commingled and combined? How do they know that this combination had not occurred previously, and that the two deities had commingled and separated from each other an infinite number of times? Maybe they're constantly weaving in and out of each other. On what basis do you say that this was a one-time event of creation where the two deities commingled, giving rise to our creation, and eventually they will separate? Maybe this is happening on a constant basis, like the theory that was put forward by certain scientists when they first developed the Big Bang theory, that we have an oscillating universe, that there's a Big Bang, and then the universe expands and expands and expands until it collapses on itself and then returns back to a cosmic egg. And there are constant iterations of this going on throughout eternity. Number 9, how do they know that at some point in the future the two deities will once again separate permanently from each other? Based on our current observation, is it not possible that they will eternally remain in their combined states? And therefore, on what basis do you say that we believe that ultimately good will prevail over evil, and good will eliminate evil from itself and remain independent, and that will be utopia? These are thus an additional 4 refutations whereby we demonstrate that they are choosing an undemonstrated model, even though they rejected creatio ex nihilo on the basis that it had never been demonstrated. Next, There are different opinions among these dualists as to what caused the two deities to commingle. Some argue that it was the good deity's desire to interact with the evil one out of a desire to temper or to reduce or to weaken some of the evil that it encountered in the evil deity. Others argue that it was the evil deity's desire to commingle with the good deity, being under the impression that the good deity contains that which is good and pleasurable and beneficial to the evil deity. And it was therefore the impetus of the evil deity to commingle with the good deity. Either way, and this is argument number 10, the good has either converted in some way to evil, or the evil has converted in some way to good as a product of this combination. This would mean that both the good and the evil deities have in some way essentially changed, which is something they assert is impossible by virtue of the fact that deities don't change. So it's a logical contradiction that if you're asserting that some being is an omnipotent, immutable deity, and yet at some point it intersected with its opposite, that intersection or that act of intersection invariably causes some change, and change is impossible to a deity, as we've discussed many times, especially when we learned Maimonides' guide. Argument number 11, part of their theory is that the purpose of the combining of the two deities is ultimately to sublimate evil and for good to predominate. However, this is logically not the case. If you just observe the reality, because he says if the good deity is the impetus for the combination, then its efforts to sublimate evil cause it greater harm than what it is seeking to accomplish. For in the process of attempting to weaken evil, it itself is exposed to and transformed into evil. So the good is not benefiting from sublimating evil, and if anything, it's becoming more harmed than it is doing good. And if the evil deity is the impetus for the combination, then evil has clearly gained by benefiting from commingling with that which is ultimately good. So in what way has good prevailed in this commingling process? Either way, we must give up hope that good will triumph over evil based on our current observations. We are not seeing good triumph over evil. And therefore, how can you believe in this idea that eventually good will sublimate all evil and will completely reject it and uncouple itself from the evil? We're not seeing that. And number 12, argument number 12, the concept of two opposites commingling in order to bring rise to physical reality is contradicted by our senses. We note that in nature, two opposites are in constant tendency of distancing from each other. Fire resists uniting with water, air resists uniting with earth. Just like you have two opposites that push against each other and resist each other, how then could two overarching deities or sources of all accomplish that which even the components, the parts, cannot accomplish? So that's another logical argument. If you're going to say that our whole reality is based on the commingling of two opposites, why then do we observe in nature that opposites repel each other? So how does that, how does it, such an unnatural commingling even take place? And now we get to the last section, is that these last three refutations are based on logical argumentation. What I've just presented to you in the last three arguments, 10, 11, and 12, are just based on logic, that everything that we see seems to contradict logically that which these dualists contend. However, even if their model defies logic, they might nevertheless argue that they have received this model from a prophetic tradition. The catch-22 is that no prophet could have come into being until after this commingling of the deities came to be. So, because every prophet is a product of this creation process of the two deities of good and evil commingling, there are therefore three arguments to refute any kind of prophet that the Zoroastrians or the Manichaeists would produce in order to testify from their deities that this is the way the universe came into existence. And this leads to argument 13. The prophet is a product of the commingling, and therefore cannot truly know the good source that he seeks to depict. If all the prophet perceives is the commingling intersection of good and evil, how can he accurately depict the ultimately good deity in its uncoupled state from the evil deity? He has no frame of reference. That's, first of all, that's argument number one. Argument number two, or number 14 in the total number, the prophet perforce contains evil within himself from the evil deity, and thus his truthfulness and his veracity is now questioned. How can we be confident in anything he says if every human being is perforce a combination of good and evil? Maybe it's the evil side that is speaking when he testifies about the cosmogony of the dualists. And finally, number 15, a prophet's veracity as a prophet can only be proven by his performance of miracles, as we find with the Torah's prophets. Miracles are de facto a departure from nature, yet their whole argument is that the universe exists based on a natural order of this deity commingling, of the deities commingling with each other, and therefore nothing can be miraculously changed. So if their whole theory is that the two deities naturally commingled and combined with each other, and therefore no miracles, no departures from nature are possible, how can a prophet ever prove what he says? In the Torah's model of prophecy, a person who presents his tradition, he performs a miracle, like Moshe Rabbeinu performed miracles for the Jews to show that he was sent by God. But how can the prophet of these dual deities present himself and prove his arguments? I have therefore now provided my 15 arguments against dualism. And then Reb Sadia says, I am not done with this discussion. I will provide more arguments against dualism when I discuss the unity of God in the second treatise. Remember, the first treatise, what we're studying now, is dedicated to proving the Torah's depiction of creation. The second treatise is to discuss the unity of God. So part of this discussion against dualism will be undertaken in the second treatise as well, when Reb Sadia proves that God is completely unitary and that dualism is impossible. Now we get to the next part of this discussion of dualism. And this is, again, this demonstrates how important this theory was, because Reb Sadia is not prepared to leave this alone. He says, I cannot exit this discussion until I address something else that is fundamentally incorrect in these dualists' theory. The dualists believe that the two deities, one of good and one of evil, are the respective sources of light and darkness. Because light and darkness is really, according to this theory, just a manifestation of good and evil, where light is associated with good and darkness is associated with evil. They thus believe that just as light is a real thing, darkness is also a real thing. But this is incorrect. Darkness is not a concept, darkness is not that which is opposite to light. It's not a real concept. It's not a real construct of something that is opposing light. Rather, darkness is the absence of light. Now, we all know this scientifically, that when you turn off the light, the reason why the room becomes dark is because there are no longer photons in the room. Now, you have to suspend that and appreciate the fact that in the medieval world, many people believed that shadows that are cast by human beings, the shadow has real substance to it. It is a real thing. It is a real construct. The darkness is a real thing. It has just as much substance as light does, as far as being a component of reality. Now, I don't agree with that, says Reb Sadia. I believe what has been confirmed by modern science, that darkness is just simply the absence of light. If they ask me on what basis do I claim this, I will provide the following three arguments. So here are the three arguments to prove that darkness is not a substance unto itself, but is merely the absence of light. Argument number one, a person cannot create a source such as darkness according to their theory. But when a person, because none of us are creators, we are part of the creation, but we ourselves are not creators. When a person stands facing the sun, all he needs to do is cup his hands to block out the sunlight, and lo and behold, darkness has been created beneath his hands. We must conclude that all he has done is to block the light, and darkness is merely the absence of light, because otherwise it turns out that any person can create darkness at a whim. And if darkness is a real substance, how do we create things like that spontaneously? Argument number two, a person cannot destroy a source such as darkness according to their theory. When a person is standing in front of one candle, he casts a shadow. All he has to do is bring more candles and surround himself, do a 360 of candles on all sides, and lo and behold, the darkness of his shadow has been destroyed. In reality, all he has done is to add more light. thereby eliminating the absence of light which casts the shadow. So therefore, once again, you can't destroy a substance that is a real substance, just like you can't create. And yet we see people destroying darkness all the time. And finally, I have never witnessed two opposing elements converting into each other. For example, water cannot be transformed into fire, nor can fire be transformed into water. But darkness becomes brightness and vice versa. And therefore, I must conclude that darkness is not the opposite of light, but rather its privation. You turn the light on and off in a room multiple times. What are you doing? You're taking opposites and converting them into each other? No, that's not possible. Now, I note this phenomenon in other parts of nature. For example, I note that the sound of someone's cries travels through the air, and the air then transmits this sound to us. When no sound is emitted in the air, we do not say that this new air is the opposite of sound-filled air, but rather it is air that is simply devoid of sound. And similarly, the same is true of the sense of smell. Air carries smell from its source. We do not say that odorless air is the opposite of odored air, but rather the absence of odor. In the same vein, air transmits light to the sight faculties in our eyes. If the air is not light or bright, we see nothing. We thus do not say that this dark air is the opposite of light, but rather the absence of light. So this is just really just hashing it through. Some may argue when thick bodies block out sunlight, it appears as if darkness is a product of these bodies and that the darkness really has substance. By the same argument, you could say that dirt is a source of darkness and that the darkness within dirt is a real thing, since it too can block out sunlight. If I take a huge clod of earth and I hold it up to the sunlight, I cast a big shadow. But the refutation to this is the fact that if you crumble the dirt finely enough and take that huge clod of earth and just crumble it up and scatter it towards the sun, you will note that it does not block the sunlight. This shows that dirt is not in itself an inherent source of darkness, but rather something that just blocks the flow of light. Now, these seem so obvious to you and me because of the world we live in, but they were not obvious in Sajja's world. Furthermore, let's say a person will argue that when a person is surrounded on all sides by candles, his shadow doesn't really disappear, but rather it just gets pushed towards his body. In other words, I have candles on one side of me, the other side of me has a shadow, but when I bring more candles on that side of the shadow and the shadow disappears, it's because the shadow just pressed up against my body instead of disappearing, because the shadow is a real thing. It's not just the absence of light, right? But the refutation to that is the fact that my body is not dark like a shadow when light is shining upon it. So where did the shadow go? If it's being pressed up against my body, then why aren't I completely obsidian? Why aren't I completely dark and black? This proves that darkness of a shadow is not inherent to every person. So this conclusively proves that darkness is not a substance like light, and this is clear as day. God also describes this phenomenon in Scripture, and this is where we're going to finish. Isaiah states that God is Yotzer Or Uvore Choshech Oseh Shalom Uvore Ra. Ani Hashem Ose Kol Ela. I am the former of light and the creator of darkness. Now notice the difference in verbs between Yotzer and Borei. The Rambam in his guide also made the same observation. When the Torah uses the word yotzer, it means to form something that is real. When the Torah uses the term borei, it is to actually create through withdrawal or privation. This is consistent, and therefore we see that darkness, borei choshech, the creation of darkness, is through the withdrawal of light. Not that darkness is a substance that needs to be formed, but rather it is through the vacuum of light that darkness sets in. This is consistent with the next phrase of Oseh Shalom Uvorei Ra, that God is the maker of peace and the creator. Again, the same word borei, which is the withdrawal type of creation of evil. We can all agree that the all-wise God does not actively create evil, but rather God creates that which is capable of containing both peace or evil, depending on man's choice. And if a person chooses to withdraw his goodness, then what sets in is a vacuum of evil. For example, if a person eats and drinks according to his need, he will experience peace. Whereas if he overeats and overdrinks, he will experience evil. We will expand on this idea in our fourth treatise when we discuss the concept of justice. Why then does Scripture ascribe both light and darkness to God's creation? It is to counter these woefully mistaken dualists which is why two separate verbs are used in the verse. God is responsible for darkness, but only through the act of withdrawal of light, not through the active creation of darkness. Furthermore, Scripture notifies us that all light and darkness is bounded, as another counter to these dualists who argue for the unbounded nature of these sources of good and evil and light and dark. Scripture thus states in the book of Job, Chok chag al pnei mayim, that God set a boundary for the water, ad tachlit or im choshech, and he did the same with light and darkness. And according to Reb Sadia, this verse in Job is a direct assault on the dualists who believe that the forces of light and darkness can spread out infinitely. No, you see from this verse that they are bounded. With this, we're going to conclude our discussion for today. We've spent an inordinate amount of time in discussing dualism and the refutation of it, simply because Reb Sadia has done that. And it's for that reason that I think that we're ready to move on. And hopefully the ensuing remaining incorrect models of creation that Reb Sadia is going to present us with, the remaining 9 arguments are going to go much more quickly, and we'll be able to cover more ground more quickly. But this was an interesting exercise for today. Let me wish you all a good week. Unfortunately, I'll be traveling next week, so our next shiur will be in 2 weeks from today. Let's hear good news from Israel. Am Yisrael Chai. Have a wonderful day, everyone.